Before we start the story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. I should have known better than to go to Tall Pines alone. I'm a landscape painter, and solitude is a friend. There's something about empty spaces and unbroken lines that helps me think. But Tall Pines, that place wasn't just empty, it was alive. I'd driven up in the RV, as far off the beaten path as I could manage, seeking a secluded spot to paint. The forest spread around me, thick with towering pines that seemed to block out every shred of sunlight. The air felt damp and cold even during the day, and everything about it was still, too still, like a place waiting for something to happen. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut as I parked in a clearing, telling myself it was just the thrill of a new place. The first thing I noticed were the marks on the trees. About 20 yards in, I found a rough X scratched into a trunk, a little faded but clear enough. I figured it was just a trail marker. Tall Pines was remote, but surely other campers and hikers had made their way through here at some point. Yet, the marks didn't make sense. Some trees had X's, some had arrows scratched into them, and they didn't lead anywhere obvious, just into the darker parts of the forest. I shrugged it off, setting up my easel and beginning to paint. The light filtering through the trees was unlike anything I'd seen before, turning the pines a strange shade of green that felt unreal. It was exactly what I'd come for, that wild beauty you can't find in any photo or map. But as dusk crept in, I started to feel wrong. The shadows seemed to stretch, creeping closer to me. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to my nerves, but the silence pressed down, making every small sound amplify, turning the forest into a maze of imagined noises. I decided I'd done enough for one day. The RV was only about a 10-minute walk back, and I could finish up in the morning. But the walk took longer than 10 minutes. Somehow, no matter how many turns I took or how many X-marked trees I passed, I didn't seem to be getting anywhere. The forest around me was thick, nearly suffocating, and my markers only seemed to lead me in loops, back to places I was sure I'd already passed. The trail grew dimmer, and each time I thought I'd found the clearing, I'd see another X-marked tree ahead, and then another, pulling me deeper. A prickle ran down my spine as I stopped and looked around, trying to calm myself. "You're just turned around, Sam," I whispered, the sound of my own voice barely reassuring me. "Just stop and look at your map." I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but it showed my location moving in dizzying loops, the coordinates bouncing around in ways that made no sense. When I tried retracing my steps, I'd just end up somewhere unfamiliar. Another thick patch of forest with more and more X's scratched into the trees. The night settled in around me, cold and heavy, until I finally stumbled back to the RV. It felt like a miracle when I saw it. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me as though something might be waiting to follow. I tried to laugh, but it felt forced, hollow. "You're fine," I muttered. "It's just the woods." But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I drifted off, I'd hear sounds outside. Soft rustling, the crackle of branches, as if something was circling the RV, getting closer. I listened for animals, anything that could explain the sound, but it was strangely rhythmic, almost like footsteps. And then, faintly, the tapping started. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the RV. But the tapping was slow, methodical, starting at the back window, then moving around to the door, then to the side, and then back again, as if something was making a slow circuit, checking every entrance. I pulled the covers up over my head, squeezing my eyes shut, willing it to be a dream. But the tapping continued, growing louder, closer, until I felt sure it was right next to my bed. I was frozen, every muscle locked in terror until, finally, the tapping stopped. Morning light trickled through the trees, and I forced myself to believe it was all just nerves. I threw open the door, hoping the fresh air would shake the memory loose, let me start fresh. But my tracks from the night before were gone. Any sign of the path I'd taken was buried under thick pine needles. The forest looked darker, the trees leaning toward each other like old conspirators, keeping their secrets from me. I almost packed up then and there. But something about tall pines called to me, urged me to go deeper, to follow the path that had led me in circles. This was a forest, I told myself. Trails change. Paths get overgrown. There was nothing to fear. So I went back in, following the X's. The deeper I went, the more strange markers I found. Not just X's now, but red-painted arrows and symbols, crude shapes that looked like they'd been smeared with clay or charcoal. They seemed random at first, but then I realized they were leading me somewhere, each new marker pointing a little farther into the woods. An hour passed, then 2. By the time I finally admitted I was lost, the light had started to fade again, painting the forest in deep greens and grays. My breathing quickened as I tried to retrace my steps, but each time I turned around, the X's seemed to multiply, spreading out in every direction. I could have sworn the forest was rearranging itself around me, pushing me into a twisted loop of trails that led nowhere. And then I saw him. The man was standing just ahead on the trail, dressed in faded hiking gear, a worn-out hat pulled low over his face. Relief flooded through me as I called out, waving my arms, trying to catch his attention. "Hey, thank God. Do you know how to get back to the main trail?" The man didn't answer. He just stood there, watching me, his face shadowed under the hat. A chill crept over me as I took a step closer, repeating my question. Still, he didn't answer, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been expecting me, waiting right here on this twisting path. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice rough, like he hadn't used it in years. "Yeah," I said, forcing a shaky laugh. "I thought I was following these markers, but they just keep leading me in circles. Do you know where they go?" He stared at me for a long time, his expression unreadable. "The endless forest," he muttered, almost to himself. "Once it takes you in, there's no way out." My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" "They made the marks to find their way back," he said, his voice distant. "But the forest has a way of keeping people." The longer he spoke, the more I realized he looked wrong. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, almost empty, as if he hadn't seen daylight in years. When I glanced away for a second, he was gone, vanished like a shadow into the trees. I called out, stumbling forward, but he was nowhere to be found. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The forest seemed to close in, pulling at me, twisting every path into another dead end. By the time I stumbled out into the clearing, I was sweating, out of breath, my pulse racing. But the horror wasn't over. That night, the footsteps returned, circling the RV with slow, deliberate steps. The tapping resumed, louder than before, almost mocking in its steadiness, as if someone, or something, was trying to draw me out, lure me back into the trees. I couldn't sleep, too afraid to even close my eyes, and as the hours ticked by, I found myself staring out the window, looking for any sign of movement. And then I saw it, the figure of the man, standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the shadows, his face expressionless, watching me with those empty eyes. Morning came, and I didn't wait. I grabbed my things, started the RV, and floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as the engine would allow. The trees flew by in a blur, and only once I saw the highway ahead did I finally breathe. But tall pines didn't let go so easily. Back home, the memory of that place haunted me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps outside my door, or see strange X's scratched into random trees on my walks, always leading me somewhere I couldn't quite reach. The endless forest, they'd called it, a place that draws you in, keeps you. And though I may have left, I know that part of me stayed behind, still lost in those twisting trails, still hearing the footsteps and the tapping, waiting to be found. The forest was perfect, dense, dark, and solitary, just what I needed. Laurel Hill State Park stretched out in front of me, silent and still, the trees standing tall like sentinels guarding some ancient secret. I parked the RV in a secluded spot off the trail, well away from any other campers. I didn't want people. I didn't even want peace. I just wanted a break from everything and everyone, a clean slate. After my breakup, I needed something new to focus on, a distraction from the spiral of self-pity and doubt I'd been sucked into. I told myself I'd write, really dig into the experiences that kept my travel blog alive. This was my job now, and I could make something meaningful out of it. At least, that's what I thought when I set out. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I'd expected the usual night sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, but there was only silence, thick, eerie silence. At first, I welcomed it, but the longer I sat in it, the more it felt like it was pressing in, like a weight. I turned in early, hoping to shake off the feeling by morning. When I woke up, the early light was cold, the forest heavy with mist. I stepped outside to take a few photos, and that's when I noticed it, a small notebook lying on the ground beside the RV. It was a little battered, its cover stained, but unmistakably familiar. I picked it up, flipping it open. My handwriting was scrawled across the pages, but I didn't remember writing a single word of it. The entries were disjointed, nonsensical, like a half-conscious mind grasping at random thoughts. Phrases like "lost in the forest," "can't escape," and "who am I?" were scattered throughout, each one scribbled with frantic intensity. A chill crept over me, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd been writing in my sleep or scrawling down thoughts and forgetting. I tucked the notebook away, brushing it off as stress, and continued with my day, trying to focus on my writing. It was that night, though, when things started to get strange. I was sitting by the fire, letting my thoughts wander, when I caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a light flickering between the trees, almost as if someone else were out there. I squinted, straining my eyes, but whatever it was disappeared. I figured it was another camper wandering too far from their sight. But when I saw the light again, it felt closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" Nothing, just silence and shadow. A prickle of unease crept up my spine as I turned back toward the RV, and that's when I noticed my camera. I could have sworn I'd left it on the RV's counter, but there it was, lying in the grass outside. I didn't remember moving it. I brushed it off, blaming my scattered mind, but something didn't feel right. I locked the door that night, though I told myself it was just for peace of mind. The next day, I went for a hike, hoping to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The trees were dense, their leaves casting shadows that seemed to ripple and shift, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking back, my pulse quickening each time I saw movement, but it was just leaves swaying or branches shifting in the wind. Then I saw him. A figure standing just off the trail, half hidden behind the trees. He was watching me, though I couldn't make out his face. I called out, "Hey, are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. He just stared, and that's when I realized I was looking at myself. My heart pounded as I squinted through the shadows, but the figure vanished, disappearing into the trees as if he'd never been there at all. I stumbled back to the RV, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a trick of the light, maybe even stress, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Something was deeply, horribly wrong. That night, the unease turned to terror. I lay in bed, my mind spinning with thoughts of what I'd seen, when I heard footsteps outside the RV. They were slow, deliberate, circling the vehicle as if someone were pacing around it. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps stopped, then started again, each step heavier, more measured. I felt a strange pull, an urge to look outside, but I forced myself to stay put. I wasn't about to confront whatever was out there. Then, through the small RV window, I saw it. My own face staring back at me, eyes empty, a strange smile twisting my features. I froze, too scared to breathe. The face stared back, unblinking, its eyes dark and hollow, its expression cold. I closed my eyes, whispering to myself, "It's not real. It's just stress. Just stress." When I opened them again, the face was gone, but the dread lingered, thick and suffocating. The next morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my things in a frenzy, ready to bolt. But every path I took led me back to the same campsite, like the forest itself was conspiring to keep me here. My phone had no signal, and the RV's engine sputtered, refusing to start no matter how many times I turned the key. I felt trapped, caged by some invisible force that wouldn't let me go. As night fell again, the footsteps returned. They circled the RV, relentless, accompanied by whispers that sounded disturbingly familiar. It was my own voice, murmuring phrases I couldn't make out. Then, slowly, one of the whispers grew louder, closer. "You can't escape," it said, echoing through the small RV. "You're stuck here, just like me." I covered my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to drown out the voice, but it only grew louder, filling the RV, wrapping around me like a vice. And then I felt it, a presence, standing right behind me. I turned slowly, dread settling like a stone in my chest, and saw him, myself, standing in the small kitchen space, watching me with hollow, accusing eyes. "What do you want?" I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted his head, a sad, mocking smile twisting his face. "Don't you know? You're here because of you. Because of what you've done. What you refuse to face." I stumbled back, feeling the walls close in around me. The figure stepped closer, his gaze dark and empty. "You can't keep running, Sam. We're all here, waiting." He gestured outside, and through the window I saw them, other versions of myself, standing in the trees, watching, waiting. Each one looked slightly different, twisted in subtle, horrible ways. One was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow. Another was smiling, but his mouth was wrong, stretched too wide, his teeth sharp and glinting. I couldn't take it. I bolted out of the RV into the darkness, hoping to outrun them, to find some escape. But no matter how far I ran, every path led me back to the same spot, the same nightmare. By the final night, I was exhausted, desperate, and defeated. I sat in the RV, staring at the twisted, contorted versions of myself standing in the trees. I knew now what they were. Echoes of me. Fragments of all the regrets, all the failures I'd tried to forget. And then the worst version stepped forward, his face a mask of malice, his eyes filled with hate. He looked at me, sneering, and I felt every ounce of my own self-loathing reflected back at me. "You'll never escape," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You'll never be free of us. You're trapped, Sam. Trapped in your own mind." I stumbled back, my pulse racing, the walls of the RV pressing in. What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. The figure smiled, cold and triumphant. "We want you to understand, to accept it. You can't run from who you are." The words hit me like a punch, and I felt something break inside me. I sank to my knees, the weight of all my regrets, all my failures crushing down on me. I'd spent so long running from myself, from everything I didn't want to face. But now there was no escape, no running, just me, alone, with the worst parts of myself. "I understand," I whispered, the words raw and painful. "I get it. I can't keep running." The figure's gaze softened, his sneer fading, and slowly, one by one, the echoes began to disappear, fading into the shadows, until only I remained. When dawn broke, I was alone, the forest silent and still. The RV engine roared to life on the first try, and as I drove away from Laurel Hill, a strange sense of peace settled over me. But even now, I can still feel them, lingering just out of sight, a reminder of what I left behind and what still waits, hidden in the shadows of the forest, in the echoes of myself. When I first parked my RV along the rim of Blackwater Canyon, I thought I'd found the perfect place to be alone. I'd left everything behind, my job, my apartment, the endless churn of stories and deadlines. All I wanted now was quiet, solitude, and maybe, if I was lucky, peace. The locals had mentioned the Raven Man when I'd stopped for supplies. Their voices hushed as they warned me not to stay near the edge of the canyon after dark. A campfire legend, I figured, spun to spook out-of-towners. But they didn't know me. I'd chased real-life monsters in my years as a journalist, men and women whose evils weren't hidden in shadows but out in the open. This, I thought, would be a welcome change, a place to breathe. I set up my little camp, made some coffee, and settled into the soundscape of Blackwater. Wind rustling through leaves, the call of a distant owl, the hollow moan of the wind sweeping through the canyon below. The air was heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, but something about it felt right. I pulled out my journal and began writing, letting the past flow through my pen, hoping to finally leave it all on the page. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, a strange unease settled in. The heavy silence of the forest seemed to press in on me, as if the trees were leaning closer, watching. I shook it off, chalking it up to fatigue. And then I heard it. It was faint, carried by the wind, but clear enough to set my nerves on edge. A voice drifting from somewhere deep in the canyon. It was distant, barely more than a whisper, but I could swear it was calling my name. Luke. The voice echoed, growing softer as it stretched out into the silence. I set down my journal, straining to hear. Maybe it was a trick of the wind, the sound warping through the canyon, distorting echoes. The human mind, I reminded myself, is wired to find patterns, even when none exist. But then it came again, clearer this time, and undeniably familiar. "Luke!" I shivered. I'd covered stories of strange phenomena before, though I'd never bought into any of it. But hearing my own name whispered out of the shadows of the canyon, that was enough to make me second-guess my confidence. I took a deep breath, leaning into my old rationalizations. It was just the wind, bouncing off the canyon walls, and the stress of being alone in the dark playing tricks on my mind. But something inside me, some stubborn kernel of instinct, kept me on edge, kept me staring into the darkness as if something were staring back. Hours passed, and the chill of the night settled deep into my bones. I'd retreated into the RV, more for warmth than protection, but the night outside only grew more oppressive. The voice had faded, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of a presence lingering just beyond the edge of my campfire's light. Around midnight, I decided to take a walk, thinking maybe fresh air would clear my mind. I stepped out of the RV and immediately noticed the smell, something faintly metallic like rusted iron. I looked around, scanning the edge of the canyon where the forest met the cliff, but there was nothing unusual in sight. Then I saw it. Small, white symbols etched into the dirt, encircling my RV. They looked like handprints at first, rough and uneven, smeared like someone had dragged their fingers through chalk. But as I bent down to inspect them, I realized they were feathers. White, dusty feathers, forming strange looping patterns that sent a shiver down my spine. A noise behind me made me stand up fast, flashlight in hand. I spun, shining the light across the clearing, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the steady, relentless silence. I laughed it off, though it sounded hollow. "All right, Blackwater. Is this the best you've got?" As if in response, a soft rustling sounded from the trees, and a shadow moved at the edge of my vision. I jerked the flashlight back to the spot, but it was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself, but the pounding of my heart suggested otherwise. I turned back toward the RV, only to see another set of white feathers in the shape of a handprint, this time smeared across the side door. My chest tightened. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the thought of someone creeping up while I was so close was unnerving. I pressed my fingers to the feathers, feeling the chalky residue, wondering if it was some kind of prank. But deep down, I felt it was something more. Back in the RV, I tried to shake the image of those feathers from my mind. I double-checked the locks, telling myself it was just a precaution. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak, every shift of the RV's frame set me on edge. And then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. Faint, almost hesitant, like someone calling from a great distance. "Luke!" I sat up, my heart pounding. This time, it was no trick of the wind. The voice was unmistakably human, with a low, melodic tone that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. I cracked open the window, peering out into the darkness. There, at the edge of my campfire's glow, stood a figure. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The figure was tall, draped in a dark coat, with a wide-brimmed hat casting shadows over its face. I could make out nothing of its features, just a vague silhouette, standing impossibly still, watching me. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking despite myself. The figure didn't answer. It simply tilted its head, as if studying me, and then took a slow, deliberate step forward. The firelight caught on something around its shoulders, feathers, glossy and black, fanning out like a raven's wings. I stumbled back from the window, a wave of nausea rolling over me. This was impossible. A trick of the dark, a hallucination born of sleeplessness and too many ghost stories. I shut the window, telling myself I'd imagined it. But when I turned back, the figure was still there, standing closer, his shadow stretching toward the RV like an invitation. "Luke." The voice drifted into the silence again, soft and mournful. "Come, join me." The figure's arm extended, beckoning me toward the canyon's edge. I felt the pull, an almost hypnotic urge to go to him, to step out of the RV and walk to the edge where the darkness waited, vast and endless. My fingers trembled on the door handle, every nerve in my body fighting the compulsion. It was as if his voice was inside my head, mingling with my own thoughts, twisting them. "You're alone, Luke," the voice whispered. "No one knows you're here. No one will care if you join me." The weight of my own loneliness crashed over me. Memories of past failures, regrets, the faces of people I'd let down over the years. The figure was right. No one was waiting for me. No one would even notice if I disappeared into the shadows. I reached for the door handle, my mind numb, his voice pulling me forward, step by step. But as my hand closed around the cold metal, a surge of defiance flared up inside me. The part of me that had fought so hard to leave the past behind, to find a future for myself, screamed against the Raven Man's call. "No," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure stopped, his hand dropping, the shadows around him seeming to shift. I took a step back, letting go of the handle, my chest heaving with each breath. The Raven Man tilted his head, his face still hidden, but I could feel his disappointment, a cold wave of fury radiating from him. "You cannot escape," he whispered, his voice a low growl. "The shadows are in you, Luke. You belong to them." The firelight flickered, and in that brief flash, he was gone. The only sign he'd been there at all was a single black feather resting on the ground outside the door. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, locking it, my hand shaking. I stayed awake until dawn, my heart racing with each passing minute, the darkness pressing in from every corner. When morning finally broke, I packed up in silence, my hands still trembling as I cleaned up camp. The feather was gone, but the memory of his voice lingered, a whispering echo in the back of my mind. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse of Blackwater Canyon in the rearview mirror. For a moment, I thought I saw him again, just a shadow, standing at the edge of the canyon, his dark wings spreading wide. The road twisted, and the figure vanished. I don't know if he was real or if it was just my own fears and regrets haunting me, but as I left Blackwater behind, one thought stayed with me, chilling me to the bone. The Raven Man wasn't just a legend. He was a warning. And next time I might not escape his call. I came to Lost Lake for peace, but I haven't felt at ease since I arrived. The stillness around here isn't common. It's the kind that settles heavily in your bones, making every rustling leaf sound like a whisper. I parked my RV in a secluded clearing a mile off the main trail, hoping a few days of solitude and nature photography would do me some good. After the accident that cost me my job as an investigative journalist, I've been trying to pull myself back together, and I thought Mount Hood National Forest was as good a place as any to start. But that first night, alone by the lake, I felt it. A sense of being watched, or maybe listened to. I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the quiet. But here, the silence feels dense, like it's hiding something. The second night, I decided to test the lake's famous echo. The stories I'd read about Lost Lake talk about strange, distorted echoes that sometimes return to you in ways that shouldn't be possible. I hadn't believed it, not really, but I was curious. So, I stood at the water's edge and called out, "Hello." The echo came back, faint but clear. "Hello?" The word rippled through the forest, softer, almost like a sigh. I couldn't help but smile. It was exactly what I'd hoped for, nature doing something magical. But then I tried again, this time calling, "Is anyone there?" My voice bounced off the trees, but the echo that returned wasn't quite right. It sounded like my words, but distorted, stretched somehow. "Is anyone there?" The last word hung in the air, a lingering question that seemed to grow louder instead of fading. I shivered, stepping back from the water. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the RV, every gust of wind, felt like someone outside, waiting, watching. I pulled the blinds tight, lay in bed, and tried to convince myself that I was imagining things. The next morning, I grabbed my camera and set off to explore, hoping some photography would settle my nerves. Lost Lake was supposed to be stunning, after all, and I needed the break from my own head. I hiked along the shoreline, snapping shots of the sun glinting off the water, the towering pines reflected in the lake's glassy surface. About a mile from the RV, I stumbled on something strange. An old, abandoned backpack lying partially buried under a mound of leaves and debris. I knelt down, curious, brushing away the dirt. The fabric was worn and faded, the straps frayed. I checked the inside, half expecting to find something rotted or spoiled, but there was nothing except an old trail map, its edges crumbling. The map looked hand-drawn, covered with strange symbols and lines I didn't recognize. Someone had circled a spot on the lake, and beside it was a faint scrawl, "Find the light." I frowned, looking around the deserted trail. There was no sign of anyone else around, and the pack seemed to have been here for years. Maybe it had belonged to a hiker who'd gone off trail and left it behind. But there was something eerie about it, as if the pack itself was a message, something someone had left for whoever found it. I tucked the map back in the bag, stood up, and moved on, trying to shake off the chill creeping over me. But as I continued around the lake, I couldn't stop thinking about that message. Find the light. What light? It was broad daylight and everything around me was drenched in sunshine. But the thought lingered, crawling under my skin. That night, as I lay in the RV, I heard footsteps outside. They started slowly, almost tentative. A few crunches on the gravel, then silence. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps started again, circling the RV, pausing right by the door. My skin prickled, and I felt rooted to my bed, unable to move. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. Silence. Then, in the distance, I heard something strange. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoing across the lake, like someone was knocking on wood or stone. The footsteps faded, and I forced myself to get up, clutching the flashlight as I peered out the window. Nothing. Just empty trees swaying gently in the breeze. But when I opened the door to step outside, I saw footprints. Wet, muddy prints that stopped only a few feet from the RV and vanished. It was as if someone had been standing there, watching, before disappearing into thin air. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight, and spent the rest of the night listening to the silence, the echo of those phantom footsteps circling in my mind. The next day, I felt an odd compulsion to follow the markings on the map. Maybe it was the investigator in me, the urge to know what I'd found, to understand why it had been left there. Part of me knew it was a bad idea, but something deeper, some stubborn curiosity pushed me on. I followed the map to the circled spot, a narrow cove at the far end of the lake where the trees grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead. The air felt heavy here, thicker, and I found myself moving carefully, as though not to disturb the place. I stopped at the water's edge and called out, testing the echo again. "Is anyone there?" My voice returned, distorted and broken, like it was being filtered through layers of water and wind. "Anyone there?" The words bounced back, changing pitch, becoming almost a question of its own. And then, after a long pause, I heard something else. A voice, faint but unmistakable, answering me from across the lake. "Help me." I froze, my heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. The voice was there, floating across the water, desperate and pleading. I turned, scanning the opposite shore, but there was nothing, just shadows and trees. "Where are you?" I called out, my voice breaking slightly. Silence. And then the faint sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves, moving slowly along the shore. I shone my flashlight across the water, the beam cutting through the darkness. And that's when I saw them. Small, faint lights dancing along the far shore, shifting and bobbing like will-o-wisps. "Find the light." The words from the map sprang to mind, and without thinking, I began wading into the lake, my eyes fixed on the lights. They flickered, moving deeper into the forest, and I felt compelled to follow, to cross the water and find them. The lake was freezing, numbing my legs, but I didn't stop. The lights drifted further, their glow almost hypnotic. And then, as I reached the middle of the lake, I saw him, a figure standing on the opposite shore. He was barely visible, a shadowy outline against the trees, but I could make out his face, gaunt and pale, his eyes wide and staring. He looked almost translucent, as though he were made of mist and shadow. The man raised his arm, pointing at me, beckoning me to come closer. "Help me." His voice drifted across the water, thin and wavering. Something in me snapped, and I realized what I was doing. I turned, splashing back toward the shore, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I reached the shore, I glanced back, but the figure was gone, the lights extinguished. The lake was still, as if nothing had happened. Shaken, I stumbled back to the RV, my mind spinning. I locked myself inside, collapsing onto the bed, trying to process what I'd seen. But the image of that man, his hollow eyes staring across the water, was seared into my mind. I spent the next day holed up in the RV, too rattled to venture back to the lake. But that night, as I reviewed the photos I'd taken, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the frame, was a picture of me lying in bed, taken from outside the RV window. I stared at it, heart pounding, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. I hadn't taken that photo. No one else was out here. But there it was, proof that someone or something had been watching me. I scrolled through the photos, my hands shaking, and found more. Images of me hiking, standing by the lake, my face a mask of confusion and fear. In every photo, a shadow lingered just at the edge of the frame, faint but unmistakable, like someone else was there, just beyond my sight. I felt sick, a cold sweat breaking out over me. The watcher, I'd heard stories of the lost hiker, the one who went missing years ago, forever searching for a way back. Was it him? Had he somehow attached himself to me, marking me as his replacement? I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, flashlight in hand, listening to the footsteps that circled the RV, stopping now and then to scrape against the walls. At first light, I packed up and left. I didn't look back as I drove away, my heart racing, my skin prickling with the feeling that I was being watched. Only when I reached the main road did I let myself breathe, the weight finally lifting as I left Lost Lake behind. Days later, back in town, I developed the photos. They were all normal. No shadows, no figures. But I could still feel the watcher's presence, a sense of eyes on me that hadn't faded. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I hear footsteps outside, circling, stopping by the window as if he's waiting, watching. I tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, that it was all a hallucination, a product of isolation and fear. But deep down, I know that wherever I go, the watcher is still there, lingering, waiting for me to return to Lost Lake. They say if you listen long enough, you'll hear them. The screams that carry across the Blue Ridge Mountains, some kind of wailing woman, maybe animal, or both. People have heard it echo from the valleys through the trees. Locals call it the wampus cat, a half-woman, half-cat creature cursed to roam these mountains, seeking revenge on anyone trespassing her woods. I'd heard the stories, even believed them a little, but I never thought I'd experience it. Do you have to drag me into every spooky legend? Connor grumbled, slinging his pack over his shoulder as we made our way down the narrow, winding trail into the heart of Shenandoah. It's always ghosts or monsters or something else that wants to kill us. Oh, come on. We're camping, I said, nudging his arm as we walked. It's perfect. Fresh air, no one around for miles, a good old-fashioned legend to make it interesting. Connor just sighed. We'd been friends forever, practically grew up together, and he'd put up with my antics for years. But he wasn't as thrilled about ghost stories and eerie encounters as I was. The day slipped by, each step taking us deeper into the park, far from any bustling campsite. By the time we found a decent clearing to set up, shadows stretched across the trees, and the chill in the air had settled firmly in my bones. We pitched our tents, stashed our gear, and set up a little fire as the dark crept over us. I'll admit it. As much as I loved horror, something about being out here felt different. The quiet, the dark, the sense of distance from the world, it all tugged at my nerves in ways I hadn't expected. But I wasn't about to let Connor see that. "Bet you $5 you hear something tonight," I teased, trying to shake the weird feeling by poking at his nerves instead. "Sure, and if I do, I'll pack up and drive us out of here myself," Connor said, laughing, but his voice didn't quite have its usual ring of confidence. The first scream came around midnight. It was faint, echoing through the forest like a distant echo that barely reached our camp. I sat up, pulse quickening, and listened, trying to convince myself it was just an owl or some other nighttime creature. But it came again, longer this time, almost human. Connor's flashlight flicked on in his tent beside mine, and I heard him rustling, his breathing sharp. "Aaron, did you—" "Yeah, I did." "Sounds like someone's out there." "Or something," I replied, half joking, but my stomach twisted. We listened, straining to hear it again. But the forest had gone still, heavy with silence, almost as if it was listening with us. My mind flitted to the stories, and the idea of that thing, half cat, half woman, with its glowing eyes and vengeful soul, gave me chills. But logic kicked in. It was just an animal. Probably. "Let's get some sleep," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. Connor didn't argue, though I heard him muttering something to himself as he zipped his tent shut. The next day, we decided to hike up a trail leading higher into the woods, looking for some overlooks and hoping the daylight would chase away last night's creepy echoes. But even as we hiked, the tension between us started building. "You know, maybe we should keep our camp closer to the main trail," Connor said, trailing behind me, his voice edgy. "We're really out there alone." "Isn't that the point?" I said, but there was a hint of frustration creeping into my tone. "We came out here to get away from it all. No people, no towns, just us and the woods." But something had shifted. We were barely talking, our steps crunching on leaves and rocks, each noise amplifying the uneasy quiet around us. Then we saw them, deep scratch marks gouged into a nearby tree like claws had scraped down the trunk. But they were too large, too wide for any animal I knew about. I ran my fingers over the grooves, cold realization settling in. Connor stared, his face pale, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Maybe there's a bear in the area," I suggested, not sure I even believed myself. Connor shook his head, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words. "Bears don't make marks like that, do they?" Neither of us had an answer. The rest of the day passed in a tense silence, and I could feel Connor's gaze lingering on the tree line, as if expecting something to leap out at us. I tried to keep my focus on the scenery, the mist drifting through the valleys, the thick trees wrapping us in their shadows. But I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on us, watching, following. That night, as we sat around the campfire, we didn't talk, just listened. We heard the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the distant calls of animals, but there was an unnatural quiet over everything, like the night was waiting for something. Connor gripped his flashlight tight, pointing it into the woods every few minutes. I could feel his anxiety gnawing at me, and I wished I hadn't dragged him into this. And then it came again, louder, a scream. It wasn't just any scream, it was mine, or at least it sounded like it, a near-perfect echo of my voice calling out, "Connor, help!" He froze, his face ashen, his eyes locked on mine. "Aaron, was that you?" "No," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The scream came again, closer, my voice calling for help but warped, twisted into something unrecognizable. Connor nearly bolted for the trees, but I grabbed his arm, holding him back. "That's not me, Connor," I whispered, my pulse racing. "It's trying to lure us out." He nodded, his hands trembling. The screaming stopped, replaced by a rustling like something was moving around our tents, circling, and every so often I caught a glimpse, a shadow slipping between trees, watching us with eyes that glinted in the firelight. I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed myself out of the tent and stared into the darkness, forcing myself to confront whatever was out there. That's when I saw it, a figure, half hidden in the shadows, standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It was a woman, or at least something shaped like a woman, with an emaciated skeletal body and long, tangled hair. But her face, it was twisted, unnatural, almost cat-like, her eyes glowing, burning as they locked onto mine. She let out a screech, the sound cutting through the night, chilling me to my core. I staggered back, and Connor grabbed me, both of us frozen, watching as she moved around us, slowly, her gaze never leaving mine. "Aaron," Connor whispered, "we need to go. Now." We bolted for the path, our footsteps echoing through the night, her screeches following us, echoing, the sound bouncing off the trees, as if she was everywhere and nowhere all at once. We stumbled and tripped, scrambling through the darkness, the path barely visible in the light of Connor's dying flashlight. I could hear her footsteps behind us, close, always close, as if she was toying with us, letting us think we could escape. And then Connor went down, his foot catching on a root, his body slamming into the ground with a sickening thud. He let out a gasp, clutching his ankle, and I knew we were in trouble. I crouched beside him, my heart pounding, trying to help him up, but he couldn't put weight on his foot. We can't stay here," he whispered, panic flashing in his eyes. The shadows shifted, and I felt her presence looming over us. I turned, heart hammering, and saw her standing there, close enough that I could see every twisted detail of her face, every unnatural angle of her body. She raised a clawed hand, pointing at us, her eyes narrowing. Desperation surged through me, and I remembered the stories, the warnings the locals had told us. This wasn't just a creature. It was a spirit, something tied to the land, cursed, vengeful. I swallowed hard, and with a shaky breath I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "We're sorry," I said, forcing the words out. "We didn't mean to trespass. We'll leave. Just please, let us go." She stared at me, her expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought she'd ignore me, that she'd attack us and end it right there. But then she let out a low, guttural growl, stepping back, her eyes still locked onto mine as if weighing my sincerity. Slowly, she turned, slipping back into the shadows, her form dissolving into the night until there was nothing left but silence. We didn't waste a second. I helped Connor to his feet, supporting his weight as we hobbled back to the campsite, adrenaline the only thing keeping us moving. When we finally made it back to the RV, I threw our bags inside, barely taking the time to pack properly. We just needed to get out. As we pulled away, I glanced back, half expecting to see her standing there, watching us leave. But the clearing was empty. The only sign of her presence, a trail of claw marks scratched deep into the trees around our camp. We drove in silence, the weight of what we'd seen pressing down on us. Neither of us spoke, afraid that if we did, it would make everything real, that acknowledging it would invite her back. By the time we reached the nearest town, the sun was rising, casting the mountains in a soft, golden light. But even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the echo of her scream lingering in my mind, haunting me. Connor looked at me, his face pale, his eyes hollow. "Never again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We're never going back." And for the first time in my life, I agreed. I rolled into Shawnee National Forest in the late afternoon, the low sun casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. It was beautiful, remote, and everything I needed. I'd come here to map out a scenic RV route for the magazine and, honestly, to clear my head after my younger brother's passing. These past few months had been a haze of regrets and restless nights, so this trip felt like a way to leave that grief behind, if only for a while. Before heading deeper into the forest, I stopped at a rickety gas station, one of the only places around. An older guy was working the counter, a wiry man with a long beard and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything. "Where you headed?" he asked, eyeing my gear as I filled up on supplies. "Down into the national forest. Going to spend a few days mapping routes and writing up a feature on scenic RV trails." The man, who introduced himself as Doc, raised an eyebrow. "You be careful out there. You don't want to get caught on one of those hollow roads." "Hollow roads?" I asked, intrigued despite myself. "Yeah," Doc said, his voice low and almost reverent. "They're narrow, winding trails that go deep into the forest. They look normal enough, but folks say they have a way of keeping people. They make you go in circles, turn you around. People go missing on those roads." I forced a laugh, but the warning crawled under my skin. Doc just shook his head, watching me as I climbed back into the RV. "Stick to the main roads," he called as I pulled away. "You'll be fine if you don't get curious." I drove on, chuckling under my breath to shake off the sense of foreboding. I'd spent years on the road. A little story like that wasn't going to scare me, but his words stayed with me as the road narrowed and twisted through the dense, shadowed forest. My GPS occasionally glitched, recalculating, as the winding trail pulled me deeper into Shawnee. The first night passed uneventfully. I found a nice clearing off the main road, set up my gear, and settled in. But as I looked over my route for the next day, the GPS stuttered again, the screen flashing erratically. The trails on the map didn't seem to match the roads I'd marked. I chalked it up to a weak signal and put it out of my mind. The following morning, I continued my journey. The further I went, the more the forest closed in, the trees crowding so close to the road that it felt like I was driving through a green tunnel. A fog rolled in around noon, thick and heavy, muting the colors of the forest to dull shades of gray. As I drove, I noticed something odd. I'd passed an old, rusted sedan parked just off the road. A little further down, a decrepit RV sat abandoned, the windows fogged with grime. Both vehicles looked untouched, as if they'd been waiting in this forest for decades. I shook my head, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping over me. Then, about a mile later, I saw that same rusted sedan again. I frowned, certain I hadn't turned back. Yet there it was, unmistakably the same car, with the same patch of moss covering the hood and cracked windows. Something was off. I tried recalibrating the GPS, but the map just spun, as if the device couldn't place me. I laughed it off, a little shakily, and kept driving. But the forest grew denser, the mist thicker, until everything outside was a blur of dark shapes and shadows. Eventually, I stopped trying to follow the GPS and decided to use landmarks instead. By evening, I was completely disoriented. I hadn't seen another car in hours, and the road kept winding, looping, pulling me further from anything familiar. The fog was so dense that even the sunlight barely filtered through, casting strange shadows over everything. The final straw came when I passed that abandoned RV for the third time. I could have sworn it was the same one, down to the peeling paint on the driver's door. My heart began to race as I pulled over, breathing hard, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. I couldn't keep fooling myself. Somehow I was stuck in a loop, driving the same stretch over and over again, no matter which way I turned. I thought back to Doc's warning about the hollow roads and felt a chill settle over me. But I didn't believe in that stuff. I couldn't. A whisper of doubt crept in, a memory of my brother's voice. "You always think you're in control," he used to say, teasing me, "but one day, life's gonna throw you for a loop." A bitter smile tugged at my mouth. "Guess you were right, Matt." I decided to park for the night, hoping things would make more sense in the morning. But as I climbed into bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound outside the RV. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, but it grew louder until it sounded like someone walking around, brushing against the side of the RV. My pulse raced as I listened, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Then, just outside my window, I heard it, a voice whispering my name. Nate. I froze, the blood in my veins turning to ice. It was my brother's voice, impossible, but unmistakable. He was gone. I knew that. Yet there was no mistaking the soft, familiar cadence, the slight lilt of his voice. Nate, come on. Don't you want to see me? The voice faded, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. I took a shaky breath, trying to convince myself it was just the wind, or a dream, or my own grief playing tricks on me. But when I opened my eyes, I saw a faint figure standing just beyond the edge of the fog. It was hazy, almost translucent, but the outline was unmistakable. Matt, standing there, watching me, his face pale and distant. I leaped out of bed and grabbed the door handle, torn between opening it and bolting. But before I could make a decision, he disappeared, fading back into the mist like he'd never been there. The next morning, I was rattled but determined to find a way out. I marked a few trees near the RV with chalk, thinking it would help me retrace my steps if I got turned around again. But as I walked deeper into the woods, the markings disappeared, as if they'd never been there. I tried again, marking another set of trees, only to find the symbols gone when I looked back. By midday, I was hopelessly lost, the fog thickening around me until I could barely see a few feet ahead. I turned back toward the RV, my heart pounding, when I saw it. An old RV, rusted and half swallowed by the forest, sitting alone in a small clearing. It looked identical to mine, down to the cracked windows and faded paint. I approached cautiously, my skin prickling with unease. The door was slightly ajar, and inside I could just make out a table covered in photos. I stepped closer, my breath catching as I saw what they were. Pictures of my brother and me, photos I'd never taken. In one, Matt was smiling, his hand on my shoulder. In another, he looked serious, his gaze distant, like he was staring at something only he could see. Then I saw a note on the table, written in a shaky, familiar scrawl. Come find me, Nate. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I ran out of the RV. My heart raced as I turned, desperate to put distance between myself and that place. The fog seemed to thicken around me, the trees blurring into strange, distorted shapes. And then, in the silence, I heard him again. Nate, you left me here. The voice was closer now, coming from somewhere behind me, soft and insistent. I didn't want to leave, I whispered, swallowing the lump in my throat. You know that. The voice stopped, and for a moment the fog lifted, revealing a narrow path winding away from the clearing. I took it, my legs moving on autopilot, praying it would lead me back to the main road. As I walked, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, like a weight lifting off my shoulders. The voice had faded, and the fog was starting to thin, revealing patches of sky through the trees. I kept walking, not daring to look back until I finally saw my RV sitting at the edge of the road, waiting for me. It looked worn, as if it had been sitting there for days, but I didn't question it. I climbed inside, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I made it out of Shawnee that day, though I can't say I left it behind completely. Every now and then, I still hear his voice, whispering to me in the quiet moments, calling me back to the forest. Sometimes I think I see that rusted RV in my rearview mirror, lingering on the edge of my sight, waiting. And on those nights, I wonder if I'll ever truly leave the hollow road. I used to think nature was the last true refuge, a place to disconnect, where eyes and screens couldn't reach. That's why I took my RV up into the Black Hills National Forest, South Dakota, one of the last places that feels untouched, where I could breathe without a trace of technology or connectivity. I was here to clear my head, to finally stop thinking about the world, about the constant noise of my job and my life in tech. I'd left everything digital behind, packing only essentials: a flashlight, an emergency radio, a compass, a couple of maps. I planned to stay for a week, hike the rugged trails by day, relax in the RV at night. But by the second night, my plans and my sense of safety started to unravel. The first hint of trouble was small, something I almost ignored. My flashlight flickered as I made my way back from an evening hike. Just faulty batteries, I figured. But then my emergency radio crackled with static that cut in and out, louder and softer, almost rhythmic. No big deal, I told myself. Just the kind of interference you get out here. Then, during a morning hike, I noticed something odd, a flash of movement overhead. I stopped, squinting up into the thick canopy of pine trees. At first, I thought it was a bird, maybe an eagle. But as I kept walking, I saw it again. A small, hovering drone, just barely visible against the sunlight. It was hovering, watching, as if it were following me. I watched it drift away, my stomach twisting uneasily. I'd come out here to escape from stuff like this. I laughed it off, but the unease stayed with me, lingering as I headed back to my campsite. That night, the forest felt wrong. There was a low, constant buzzing, like the hum of an electric motor. It wasn't the usual forest noise, I knew that much. I sat up in bed, listening, straining to make sense of the sound, trying to convince myself it was just the wind or an insect too close to my ear. Then the buzzing grew louder. I stood, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The hum was steady now, droning softly in the air around me. The pines stretched tall and silent, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. I scanned the sky, but nothing was visible in the dark. When I turned to go back inside, I spotted it again, a small light blinking faintly in the shadows of the trees. It hovered just for a moment before darting back into the darkness. A drone. It had to be. "Who's out there?" I called, feeling foolish. Only silence answered. I told myself it was nothing, just someone else's equipment. But as I settled back into bed, the dread stayed, a quiet whisper at the back of my mind. The next morning, I set out to find some peace and clear my head, hiking to a part of the forest far from my camp. But as I walked, I began noticing strange marks on the trees, small, intricate carvings that looked like symbols or coordinates. It didn't take long for a pattern to form. The markings were evenly spaced, creating a grid. I stopped, my skin crawling. These marks weren't random. Someone was mapping the forest in a methodical, almost military-style way. I glanced around, suddenly feeling very alone. I couldn't shake the sense of being watched, of something tracking my every step. As I made my way back to the RV, I saw it again. The drone. This time it was closer, hovering just overhead, as if it were watching my every move. I picked up a rock and hurled it into the air. The drone zipped away in an instant, moving too fast for anything human-made, vanishing into the treetops. That night, I locked myself in the RV, the strange tension settling over me like a heavy blanket. I heard the hum again, faint but persistent. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But then the lights in the RV began to flicker, the power surging erratically. The hum grew louder, closer. Suddenly, the radio switched on by itself, blasting a high-pitched tone that echoed through the small cabin. I lunged for it, hitting the off button, but the static kept going, punctuated by faint, broken voices that sounded like distorted laughter. My heart pounded as I yanked the radio's power cord. Finally, the noise stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. But outside, I could see it. The drone was back, hovering just outside the RV window, its lenses flashing with a strange, almost sentient intelligence. It stayed there, blinking at me, as if daring me to make a move. I grabbed the flashlight, aiming it at the drone, but it didn't budge. The lights on it flickered, and for a split second it projected something. Dots, dashes, almost like Morse code. It was trying to communicate. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as I backed away. The drone's lights flashed faster, the hum growing louder, filling my ears until it was all I could hear. I felt trapped, caged, like a lab rat in some twisted experiment. I grabbed my bag, stuffed in anything I could reach, and bolted out the RV door. The woods were pitch black, the trees towering overhead, casting jagged shadows across the narrow path. I ran, my flashlight flickering as I weaved through the underbrush. But no matter how far I went, the hum followed, steady and relentless. Then, through the trees, I spotted it again. The drone, hovering just above eye level, almost close enough to touch. Its blinking lenses looked more like eyes now, watching, waiting. I swung my flashlight at it, but it easily darted out of reach, circling me in a way that felt taunting, almost playful. The hum grew louder, joined by faint whispers, broken fragments of speech that made no sense. It was as if the drone were repeating pieces of my own thoughts back to me, twisting them, distorting them. "You wanted peace," it whispered, the words clipped, mechanical. "You came to be alone." I stumbled back, tripping over a fallen branch, but the drone stayed with me, lowering until it was level with my face. I could feel the electric hum vibrating in my bones, as if it were reading my mind, seeing every fear, every regret. My breaths came faster, shallow and panicked, as I scrambled to my feet and took off deeper into the forest. I knew I couldn't outrun it. But as I turned a sharp corner, I saw something. A tree marked with the same strange symbol I'd seen before. I remembered the grid, the pattern. The markings led somewhere, and in that moment I realized I was being herded, funneled towards something. But what choice did I have? Following the markings, I pushed forward, branches slashing at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush. Eventually, I stumbled into a small clearing where a metallic structure rose from the ground, half buried and covered in moss, blending seamlessly into the landscape. A small control panel blinked faintly on its surface, glowing with an eerie green light. The drone hovered close behind me, its hum louder than ever, almost frantic. I knew, without knowing how, that this was its source, its control. I lunged forward, fingers fumbling as I pressed at the buttons on the panel, desperately trying to find a way to shut it down. The drone circled me, its hum morphing into an angry, high-pitched whine. I hit a final button, and the structure emitted a loud pop, sparks flying as the lights on the control panel flickered and died. There was a strange, electric hiss, and then silence. I turned to see the drone twitching, its lights dimming as it slowly descended, finally collapsing to the ground in a heap of metal and wires. For a long moment, I stood there, breathing hard, staring at the drone's lifeless form. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread, like I'd severed a thread connecting me to something I couldn't understand. I stumbled back to the RV in a daze, half expecting another drone to appear, but the forest was silent, the hum gone. I started the RV, my hands shaking, and pulled onto the narrow dirt road, leaving the forest behind. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of movement in my rearview mirror. Several more drones hovering at the edge of the tree line, watching me, their lights blinking in unison. They didn't follow, but even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was part of something larger, something meant to monitor, record, or worse. Back in the city, I can't look up without feeling like I'm being watched. Drones follow me wherever I go, or maybe I'm just imagining it. But the hum, that low electric hum, still lingers at the edge of my hearing, reminding me that nowhere, no matter how remote, is ever truly beyond reach.